All right, recording. So we had a request for a few motions. One of on the something about emotional management and whether people should be able to irreversibly cut people off. I think we've had a discussion about that motion to some extent on the motion discussion channel already. So I'll just add some of my thoughts for that motion over there. Afterwards, for today, this was the motion that was supposed to be done either last week or the week before, I can't remember, that the US should abandon the idealization of democracy in its foreign policy. So I'm just going to walk you through the process of constructing the Gulf case and the op case. And yeah, I hope that I hope you guys find that helpful. Government. Okay. So the first thing you have to do in any debate, any motion at any level is to figure out what is this debate supposed to be about. And that is identifying the central claim or the central question that this motion seeks to answer. So in this debate, and like the way to do that is sort of to ask questions about the wordings of the motion to figure out the context and eventually identify the problem in status quo that the debate intends to solve, or like at least the center point surrounding that the discussion surrounds. So in this case, when we talk about the US abandoning the idealization of democracy, I think first most obvious question is like, who is the US? Second is, what is idealization? Idealization of democracy. What does it look like? How has it influenced this foreign policy in the past? And I guess the last thing, maybe not that, I'll just put it here. Okay, foreign policy. Okay, so who's the US? United States of America, obviously one of the most powerful nations in the world. Strong military and economy, influence over other nations. You can put there rivals with China, etc. Influence here, you can put there donates to international organizations, etc. Environmental aid. Organizations like the UN, the UNSC, WHO, the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, a whole bunch of organizations. So anything you know about the US, you can just throw it out there. You can put there Joe Biden, Democrats, and a whole bunch of other contexts about the political situation in the US. Okay, the second question, I think where most of the debates likely to occur, is what does the idealization of democracy look like? So we know that democracy is basically a system of governance, right? It's where people vote for their leaders, either through political parties or through the direct election in the case of presidential elections, such as the US. Okay, so election of leaders by the people is also characterized by separation of powers and mutual accountability. So like basically separation into the judiciary, the executive, as well as the legislative branch as parliament. And if you know anything about democracies, you know that these three arms of democracy have ways that they hold each other in check, basically. Am I recording? Yeah, it's recording. All right, great. So what this looks like basically, or like the reason why the power is separated is to prevent one single person or one single arm of government in accruing and getting too much power, and thus abusing that power and utilizing it in ways that don't benefit the people on the ground. Okay, so separation of powers implies mutual accountability. Supposedly it's a better system of governance, but the quality of the government depends a lot on the quality of its implementation. So if it's just implemented like crap, then obviously the system of governments may not be that good after all. Specifically, what the idealization of democracy and how it manifests in foreign policy often looks like the US trying to exporting democracy. And the thing about the US is that they don't really take no for an answer. So if US comes over and says, hey guys, you have an autocracy that's oppressing the people, and then the leaders, they're like, oh yeah, we kind of like the system. The US isn't going to say, all right, good day, live, go on your merry way. The US is just going to inject democracy into you, okay? until you have no choice but to become a democratic nation. So I think one of the ways that this has been done before. Okay, we'll just look at a whole bunch of failed systems first. Okay, so first and most obvious is Iran and Afghanistan, Iraq and Afghanistan. So basically, the reason why the US intervened into Iraq and Afghanistan, so aside from the fact that George W. Bush believed that there were weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, it was also because Saddam Hussein, that time the dictator over Iraq, was quite a oppressive one, and was basically, you know, oppressing the rights of the people and like being quite bad. Okay, Saddam Hussein, dictator, oppressing his people. To be fair to the US here, I think that Saddam's oppression was quite bad, actually. It's like the way that Myanmar is now, the way China is towards Rohingyas now. So it's actually quite terrible. So the US did have some reason to intervene there. Obviously, they intervened. They took a fight against the local militia and the local military. They beat them because obviously they have very strong militaries and stuff. And Saddam Hussein was hanged for crimes against the people, and a pseudo-democracy was implemented and put in place. The problem with that, and with Iraq and Afghanistan basically, is that the systems of democracy or the people in that country weren't ready to have a democracy and was not going to accept an imposition of democratic values from a foreign power that basically walked into the country and cut off the head of their leader. Right? So, imposition of democracy, not good, not legitimate, no support from local people. Okay, so in order for a government to be legitimate, you need to have the support from the people that you are governing. Because obviously, if the people don't support you as a state, and like the primary function of a democratic government is to, you know, be representative of the will of the people, then obviously, if you don't represent the people and people don't support you and recognize you as a legitimate government, then you should not be in power. You should not hold power. Unfortunately, Ashraf Ghani disagrees, and yeah, that's why Afghanistan is like the way it is today. A little bit of context about Afghanistan specifically. The Taliban, which is an extremist group, or at least currently branded an extremist group, is actually one of the local militias that the US cooperated with when they were trying to push out the Saddam Hussein government, the Ba'ath government, I think, at that time. So basically, it was a local militia. The US gave them arms, the US gave them training, and they basically fought back against the Saddam Hussein regime. But afterwards, when the US asked for their arms back, the Taliban basically said, no, we don't want to work with you anymore. We're going to take all your weapons and we're going to form our own group. And the group that they formed under the leadership of Osama bin Laden was none other than Al-Qaeda. And later went on to commit the world's most famous terrorist attack, the bombing of 9/11, the World Trade Tower, and all that. So that's basically what happens when you give weapons to a military in hopes that they will try to help you. Yeah. Okay. Ronald said, wasn't that the Soviet invasion? I cannot remember. I honestly can't remember. I just know that the Taliban got weapons from the Iraq was Saddam Hussein, yes, correct. I know that the Taliban was a local militia that was funded by a foreign power. I think it's the US. If I'm not wrong, I think it was the US, but it's possible that it's the Soviet, because the Soviets also did intervene in Afghanistan around that time. For context, Afghanistan is next to Pakistan, which is not that far from Russia, which back then was still the Soviet Union. So that's why they had an interest in the region. Okay, anyways, let's look at a better example. I think there's two examples that I can think of. The first is Iran. So the Iranian Revolution of 1960 something, 1970 something, Iran Revolution, where basically the current political leaders, that is the Ayatollah, they overthrew the Revolutionary Guards or something like that. Basically, the Iranian Revolution was orchestrated and organized by the CIA. Okay, by the CIA, funded by the US. And the reason they did this was very simply the same reason that the previous leaders and government in powers were an autocracy, and that autocracy was oppressing the people and doing a lot of bad stuff that the US was like, no, we can't have these kind of things happening around the world. So that's how they did that. On the plus side, so aside from the fact that Iran is basically being sanctioned, or was sanctioned previously anyways, Iran is actually one of the best functioning democracies in this world. It is funded by US, currently functional democracy, representative of the people. Yep. So the system of governance in Iran right now is quite functional in that there are political parties, that the state has quite significant popular support. And at least there is the capacity for democratic revolution is there. And all in all, it's one of the better functioning democracies in the world. The reason why they were sanctioned is because they attempted to develop a nuclear weapon. And obviously, Obama negotiated the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA basically, which is normally known as the Iran deal. That basically said that the world will release sanctions on Iran if they stop investing in the nuclear program. And that deal basically was upheld until Trump pulled out of it and then unilaterally reimposed sanctions on Iran. So right now, the rest of the world technically is no longer sanctioning Iran. It is only the US, which is why the EU and most other places around the world, like Southeast Asia, Africa, and stuff, like technically can trade with Iran. I don't know, I'm not sure about how many nations actually are doing that though. But anyways, that's one of the examples where the imposition of democracy was okay. The other one that's touted as a successful humanitarian intervention is Libya. So context of Libya, Muammar al-Gaddafi was the strongman dictator in Libya. It was quite oppressive for the people in that he didn't really care about the welfare that much in terms of infrastructure development. The development was very centralized in the capital of Tripoli, I believe, if I'm not wrong. And basically, a lot of the people weren't very satisfied in the way that he was leading the country. He was a military dictator. He rose into power on the basis of his legitimacy as a military general. And back then, when Libya was still at war, he was a very well-known war hero. And like that's why he was popular enough to be appointed as the dictator. But anyways, Gaddafi, so Gaddafi's reign came to an end when during the Arab Spring, basically a whole wave of protests throughout the Middle East. It spread over to Libya as well. They formed protests against the state, and Gaddafi cracked down violently on those protesters, like just ordering the military to shoot them and like kill the protesters essentially. And like that, or the killing of your own citizens en masse, is the justification required for NATO to launch a military intervention into Libya. So let's put there. Gaddafi, military dictatorship, oppress people a lot, shut down protesters, which legitimize NATO intervention. So long story short, a coalition of the willing, including France, Belgium, and the US, I think those were the biggest contributors of troops. They intervened into Libya. They set up a safe zone for the protesters and prevented the military from killing people, like they enforced a no-fly zone as well. And sometime later, Gaddafi was forced to retreat. The protesters and the opposition caught him as he was fleeing, and they basically shot him on video. Like the whole world can see the death of Muammar al-Gaddafi. But the more important part about the Libyan context is what NATO did afterwards. Because the first thing they did was to set up this National Transitionary Council, NCC. I can't remember exactly what the term is like. National Transitionary Council, something, NTC. I can go fact check this later. But anyways, what this council did was that this body was responsible for the transition of power from a power vacuum post al-Gaddafi or post Gaddafi's death to a, so to speak, democratic system. So what this looks like is basically the forming of political parties. They created a parliament, yeah, set up political parties, set up parliament, set up elections, where people could vote and elect their leaders. So the first round of elections, it was the majority consensus on the ground is that that first election was free and fair, and therefore the outcome of it, in terms of the coalition government that was elected into power, was like legitimate, so to speak. The problem with this is that democratic horse trading in parliament is quite different from being a military warlord in your own country, or in your own region. So the leaders weren't willing to make compromises. The leaders weren't willing to represent the people, and the leaders weren't really afraid of mechanisms of accountability, just because those mechanisms didn't really exist. Like the media wasn't really there. You don't really have an educated populace, which means that people are not voting on the basis of the policies that you can do, or not voting on the basis of holding you accountable for things you've done. They usually vote on the basis of how they feel about you, how much they like you, which by and large meant that the Libyans, 47 or so ethnic groups, would split along party lines, and that's why the parliamentary the parliament that was eventually created and the coalition government didn't really have the majority support or the capability of pushing the nation forward, right? So coalition government didn't know how to govern. So whenever there's political gridlock and things don't happen, economic development comes to a stall, people get very upset. And what happens in this particular coalition was that because a lot of the political parties are basically just ex-militias, what they did was that they just reverted back to becoming militias. They started arming themselves and they started ruling their regions using violence and force. Somewhere around after the transitional government was created, there's this very charismatic general called General Haftar. He used to be a general in Gaddafi's army, and then he left to the West to do something, I think to study, whatever. But basically he came back and tried to launch this campaign to sort of clean up Libya, so to speak. And it's one of the, he's basically the de facto leader of the opposition in Libya right now. So unfortunately, because the various political parties decided to radicalize, decided to take up arms again, Libya is no longer considered a democracy, but rather considered to be in a state of civil war, with General Haftar on one side and all the parties that support him, like mainly those in the north, if I'm not wrong. And on the other side, also Haftar basically leads the Libyan National Army, or the LNA. On the other side, you have the government of national accord, like so to speak, the legitimate elected government, which is like the upper house of the Libyan parliament. That's led, the government national accord is called the GNA. So GNA and LNA are just fighting for influence, fighting for power. Libya is not that much better than it was under Gaddafi. In fact, you could even make the case that if NATO never intervened within Libya and they continued to live under Gaddafi, even if Gaddafi, quelled all the protesters using force, arguably the quality of life for people in that nation could have been better as of now. Okay, so after all this long rambling, basically, this is how the idealization of democracy has influenced US foreign policy. Okay, foreign policy, this is basically the US's interest abroad. What this looks like in terms of how it's executed is just how the military uses how the US uses its military, how the US uses its funding in terms of developmental aid, and how the US acts in international organizations and create and enforce international norms, like norms supporting democracy, norms supporting the respect of human rights, things like that. So basically, there's two things here: military and money. Okay, it looks like I'm to aid funding for organizations and stuff. Okay, so in this debate, it's basically a analysis motion on whether the US should abandon the idealization of democracy. So what Gov needs to prove is that it is preferable for the US to do so, and obviously Op needs to prove the converse, that the US should not do that. So some people call it a true value debate, to debate whether the statement is true. You can also call it a value judgment debate as to what the US should prioritize more. So on government, right? So the thesis on government support the US abandoning the idealization of democracy in its policy. That means you want to show that this brings more benefits than harm, right? So your burden is basically to show the benefits outweigh the harms. Similarly, on opposition, you just need to show that the US abandoning the idealization of democracy creates more harms than good. That's all. So that's what the value judgment is. And obviously, I think you can figure out the thesis of the debate without going through the entire problem of talking about all this stuff. But regardless of how you do it, you just need to do both at the end of the day. Okay, so the question then becomes, if this is the thesis of the debate, or like the central question of the debate, and your burden on Gov is to prove that this creates, or the benefits of this move outweigh the harms, the first thing to sort of identify then is what exactly the abandoning of the idealization of democracy looks like and how that manifests in your world. So what this also means is the world building for the counterfactual that you are defending on government, right? I think it's really important because, like, especially when it comes to IR debates, where there's a lot of different there's different levels to which you can push a policy. So the counterfactual building that you support, and obviously it's in your interest to go as hardline as possible, like 99% of the debates that you are in. So what this looks like will directly affect the extent to which your impacts manifest and materializes in like the real world. And that is going to be necessary or important in terms of convincing the judge that your side of the house should win. Okay, so what does the counterfactual look like in this world? US abandoning idealization of democracy. So this looks like dropping the narrative and norm that democracy is the best form of government. No longer insisting on democratic reforms in foreign policy. Stopping all efforts to inject democracy to other nations. Okay, be it overt or covert. Okay, doesn't matter, they're just going to stop all of it. This also means removing / reducing sanctions on autocratic states. Like big caveat here, if they're building a nuclear weapon, you probably still want to sanction them. But if you are sanctioning them just because they are not democracy, then you want to remove those sanctions. Unless for reason not to. And what's that? Starting or restarting rather economic trade relations with non-democratic nations. This is what you have to defend on government. To some extent also, if you're up in this debate, you would want to push government to defend the worst forms of autocracy and why the US may want to support democracy in those places. So things like, what if states crack down on protesters violently? What if governments are jailing political opponents and dissidents? And in government, because you are abandoning the idealization of democracy, that is a trade-off that you have to take. So obviously, you cannot chicken out of that on Gov and say, oh, but we'll support some level of intervention in like certain areas where it's required and stuff. Like, no, cannot. Okay. The only thing you can support on Gov is a humanitarian intervention in the case of genocide and stuff. But I think that's quite different from the idealization of democracy. Yeah. So I think that's something just to be aware in terms of the trade-off that needs to happen in terms of Gov. Okay, so moving on then into explaining why the harms of idealizing democracy has outweighed the benefits. So what is the harm? Idealizing democracy. So here's where all the contextual examples that I gave up here becomes relevant, because you need to explain how US foreign policy has acted in the past and how it has manifested in order to prove that the idealization has created a set of harms that could otherwise have been avoided in the counterfactual, or at least in this debate, will no longer accrue into the future, right? So the harms of idealizing democracy are, put there, Iraq, terrible mess now. You can look at Libya, back to civil war. You can look to Nicaragua also, actually. The Nicaragua is basically the Contra Revolution, where the CIA funded the uprising of the local Contra rebels to push back against the Nicaraguan government. I can't remember how successful they were, but I just know that the outcome of the nations that they are now is just not very developed and quite terrible. Okay, so you need to explain all of the context here and why it has led to a whole bunch of harms, obviously. And in order to prove that the harms of idealizing democracy, or the concept of idealizing democracy is likely to happen, or like has happened before in ways that are bad. Okay, so that's first thing in terms of explaining the harms exist. The second part here of the argument, and here's where you really need to build the analysis to prove or to explain the structural reasons as to why these harms are likely to accrue in the future. So structural reasons are basically reasons that apply in a majority of examples, because obviously if it only affects a small group of people or only affects a small number of people, or it's like an outlier in terms of examples, that's probably not a very convincing premise to build a case of. So identifying the structural analysis as to why the claim you are making is true is necessary to prove on balance of probabilities that it is likely to manifest into harms most of the time. Okay. Structural reason. Why is it true? Idealizing democracy often creates a quagmire that the US cannot opt out of. I think first thing you can talk about just different cultural contexts. So obviously, the culture of the US, like white people, is just very different from the culture of Iraq, like Arabic people in general. And therefore, the US is saying you should do things like this is probably not very effective. In fact, it's been shown to not be effective in status quo already. So I think here is where you can look at difference or like lack of information. So lack of information is important because if you want to help those countries move forward and try to develop them in ways that are positive, you obviously need to know how that society functions, how the culture of that society works, and stuff, in order to like know how to move the nation forward. So a very easy example here is that a lot of the Arabic world is Muslim, and what the US did is that they sort of tried to go in and quote unquote empower women by forcing them into schools and education and like asking them to take out the quota and stuff. And obviously the people there who have been raised in religion their entire life. It's just like, the fuck are you doing, right? Like, honestly. So because of that, the US didn't really understand the cultural context, and that's why the approach to try to help those local people were rejected as a result of that. So lack of information means decay how best to move the nation forward. The second outcome is that there you don't for the people, the local people, because seen as imposition, and obviously you are violating their culture. You are telling them to do things that they don't understand why they need to do, and overall you are just making their lives miserable, and that's why they're just not going to support you. I think the more crucial or the more pernicious harm here is that the lack of legitimacy from people in those places directly leads to opposition towards the US, right? Different cultural context, creation of opposition groups. So the best form of opposition is when they form into some sort of body and tell the US that they are bad. But more realistically, how this has manifested in reality, obviously because the US is not really going to listen to people, is that they form into decentralized terror groups and they engage in guerrilla warfare against the US military, right? Especially radical groups use asymmetric warfare. So guerrilla warfare is an example of asymmetric warfare techniques, where basically, if you use asymmetric warfare, you can, or those tactics, you can, as a relatively smaller force, inflict harm on a relatively larger and more powerful force. Yeah. So in this case, the US military obviously is technologically superior. They have better weapons, they have better guns, there's a lot more soldiers and stuff. If you are an opposition group or if you are a radical militia in the Middle East, you're not going to fight the US head on, like it's just suicide. So, I mean, some of them are willing to do suicide bombing, but that's another story. But anyways, engaging in asymmetric warfare means that you creep around silently, you hit them where they are weakest and stuff, and then you pull back quickly. So especially when the army is overstretched because they need to defend a lot of land and defend a lot of region and stuff, you target your attacks in one small focus area so that you can inflict harm upon them, not necessarily taking a lot of retaliation in return. You also have knowledge of the terrain and stuff. So if you talk about the US during the Vietnam War, they basically drove their tanks into the swamp, and tanks don't drive well in the swamp. So the tanks didn't work very well. And now the Viet Cong, the Viet Cong and the NVA, the North Vietnamese Army, they were killing the US soldiers through the trees, and the US just couldn't see who was shooting at them. So it's like they would shoot and then run away, shoot and then run away and stuff. And all these things just made life terrible for the US military. And at the end of all of that, when the US eventually left Vietnam, it was widely considered that the US lost the war in Vietnam, which is why to some extent the Vietnamese government is still socialist. Okay, so these are all structural reasons that apply across a majority of the cases where the US has attempted to export democracy and how it has led towards worse outcomes, right? So I think that's all of these things stem from having a different cultural context. You can also, the next thing you can look at then is in terms of the post-war reconstruction. And like, obviously this doesn't, or rather post-war reconstruction applies to places where the US has intervened in military, but it can also look at places where the US has attempted to intervene, either militarily or economically, like, imposition of sanctions or like conditional aid and stuff, how those places have reacted and how they were able to, move forward like that. So I just want to look at post-war reconstruction here. Here you can look at the concept of Libya. Parliament fell apart. Civil war again. Yeah. But the reason as to why post-war reconstruction is likely to fail most of the time is because it requires a very long, sustained effort. Requires long, sustained effort, funding, etc. And because most Western nations are democracy, it is just not very politically popular for you to consistently and continuously fund the reconstruction of a nation outside of your borders. Like most people in the US, if they are not racist, neo-Nazis, care more about the lives and the things happening to them directly. And I will point out that the US has quite a bit of internal structural issues that probably they want to focus on and fix first. But the point here is that it is often not politically popular for nations to give money and give funding towards other nations in order to rebuild. And that's why there's often insufficient funding for infrastructure development, for economic development, which is why there's a lot of problems of scarcity and people turn towards alternatives in order to survive, like out of desperation and stuff. Okay, not politically popular, nations won't do it. Obviously, this is different from intervening in a genocide, because when those images become public, then there's a very strong public sentiment that, oh, we need to go in and prevent more deaths. Like that kind of narrative and that kind of sentiment is very easy to accrue. And that's why there's usually a lot of support for those kinds of interventions. But the problem is that after that, the development is relatively slow. There's nothing to report on. It's nothing interesting. And people just don't care about things in other countries that doesn't directly affect them, which is why efforts to sustain reconstruction in the future is likely to fail most of the time. In fact, you can look in various places like in Libya. The Transitionary Council government, they asked the NATO forces to stay for 2 more months while they solidified their grip on power and stamped out the last of the resistance. The French and US government said no. They just pulled out like that. And that's why, to some extent, the opposition was not fully stamped out, or rather the autocratic remnants were not fully stamped out. And that's why they came back to rally in the future again and like made life very difficult. So that's why post-war reconstruction is likely to fail. Why are all these things important? Because you need things like infrastructure development to the nation. You need things like functional government. Okay, represent people, semblance of elections. You also need to directly the provision of goods and services. So this is just simply food, right? People that are starving are willing to do anything. Okay, and then obviously they need to have creation and enforcement of laws. The rule of law dictates that nobody is above the law, even the government. However, if the institutions to enforce those laws do not exist, then the existence of those laws are quite meaningless. So it just simply, if you can steal food from someone and get away with it, then why wouldn't you do it, right? And that's why in the absence of a functional government, you often have things like looting in the streets, you often have things like violence, and the police can't crack down on it because there's no central government holding things together. The power vacuum and the reconstruction is just not there. So what this looks like, it creates massive systems of poverty, massive systems of inequality, and just not providing the necessary prerequisites for the nation to develop and move past the bad situation that they were in. So that's what poor post-war reconstruction looks like. And obviously, once you explain the political incentives, it becomes very difficult for opposition to say things like, oh, we've learned from the past and are likely to invest in the future, just because these political incentives are likely to continue and just likely to be sustained, which means on balance of probabilities, the Western nations, especially the US in this circumstance, is probably not going to invest in the development of the third world. Okay, are there any other reasons that you guys can think of as to why idealizing democracy is likely to lead towards outcomes? Okay, so if not, the last part of the argument here on the Gulf case is fleshing out the reasons as to why the US pivoting away from the idealization is likely to lead to more beneficial outcomes. So here's where you sort of want to flesh out the counterfactual and why it often leads towards better outcomes in the future, right? So we've already talked about what the counterfactual looks like, and US abandoning the idealization of democracy. How does this lead to greater benefits? So pivoting away creates better benefits for nations. I think the first thing you can look at here is that in terms of just avoiding the problems of intervention, and here's where you just want to make the claim that the outcome of an intervention, even the most successful one in Libya, is just not worth the cost that it creates. Outcome of intervention is worse than the existence of a dictatorship. Okay, you can look at power vacuum and civil war in Libya compared to strongman dictator in power. So at least Libya had some semblance of education. Like Libya, the National Libyan University before Gaddafi fell was actually one of the most progressive universities in the Middle East, and one of the first universities to accept female scholars. So actually, that's a benefit you can talk about. You can also look at most other autocratic nations in the world right now that have economic prosperity and some semblance of stability. So like China, obviously with the CCP, like yes, sure, massive human rights violations happening over there, but they're still one of the most stable nations and one of the richest nations in the world today. You can look at places like Bahrain, places like Brunei. These are all constitutional monarchies where they are effectively an autocracy, but they still bring economic development towards the people on the ground. Right? Economic stability, e.g. Bahrain, Brunei. Yeah, I can't really think of other examples now. So why is this preferable? I think there's two things you can say here. The first is that economic stability improves or just means that, no, sorry. It's political stability begets economic stability, right? So you need to have a stable government in order for you to have things like FDI coming in order for businesses to function, in order for the rule of law to exist, so that people can exist within a society and function like a society is supposed to function. So in the context where this doesn't happen, you're just less likely to have things like that. So FDI, business, laws, court, contracts, functional police, like all these kind of things. It doesn't matter whether the state is not representative of your interests. These things are more likely to happen because there's political stability. You can also say, secondly, that econ stability improves the quality of life, improves quality of life because you have more money. The state has funding to distribute welfare and give you food and stuff. And afford better things. State has welfare and stuff and other things. So that's why political stability begets economic stability. Second thing I would say is that generally speaking, there are trends moving towards democracy or trends moving towards internal revolution and change of government. So what this means is that basically, if it is true that autocracies and autocrats are massively oppressing the people and abusing their people to like greater extents, this means that the likelihood of them being overthrown internally by militias and other groups is likely to be higher, right? So you can just talk about the potential for internal regime change. Right. So Let's first take the low-hanging fruit and talk about Jordan. So during the Arab Spring, the king of Jordan, so yeah, basically the people in Jordan said, we don't want monarchy anymore. The king of Jordan said, okay, we'll step down. King abdicated the throne during Arab Spring, directly transition to democratic government. So that's like the easy example where that happens. The more difficult examples, or like examples where you can show that deep-seated oppression within the system is likely to create opposition, is like I don't know, like just literally every single autocratic state, like Russia, for example, has a lot of opposition within its borders, which is why the KGB needs to keep cracking down on them. Like in Iraq, the Taliban or the Mujahideen, which form the majority of the Taliban, were the discriminated minority in that place. And that's why they were pushing back and fighting against the Saddam Hussein government. Like, how to say? I think that's how you spell it. Taliban pushing back against government. Other examples of internal revolution. I can't really think of any, but basically these are examples of, oh, Zimbabwe, yeah. Okay, opposition, pushing back against Mugabe, and yeah, these things. So this is like the most violent form of revolutions, but these things can happen, and the outcome of those revolutions is usually better because at least the US is not involved, because the US getting involved often leads to like a whole bunch of proxy conflict, and that's just like quite dangerous. So even in the worst case where internal violent revolution leads to worse harms, the involvement of global superpowers often makes things worse and complicates international politics, and that's still preferable in this world. The final thing is to just talk about general transitions. So most nations, like post-colonial states like Malaysia, for instance, we sort of have a pseudo-democratic system, but just letting those democratic systems develop over time means that as the people become more educated, as the people become richer, by the Maslow hierarchy of rights, once your primary needs have been met, you then start looking towards your secondary and tertiary needs. This is when people are more likely to start holding the state into account, even if they are autocracies. Autocracies, by and large, derive their legitimacy from the support of the people, which is why they have incentives to maintain economic stability and stuff. So, yeah, correct. So here's where, like, I mean, this is basically the first thing up here. Lah. So, here's where you say, even if autocracies don't represent people legitimacy depend on support, incentive to provide quality of life to some extent. Anything is preferable than the alternative, right? So here's where you can prove, or the final part of the graph case here is just weighing all these things and explaining why you are better. So weighing metrics, I think the first and most obvious one is where are smaller nations better off? And here's where you can explain that those nations and the people within those nations have far better off in a world where the US no longer intervenes within those places. Where US interests best protected. Obviously, it is in a world where the US is not stuck in a quagmire, where they need to keep their troops in the Middle East and need to keep supporting and funding them, need to keep investing in developing the military budget, and they're not investing in the local development of their own country. And obviously, they have a democratic duty to prioritize their people. These are all reasons why the US interests are far better off if they no longer intervene in like outside. or other nations. Other weighing metrics, whereas smaller nations or the people in India. Yep. So if you push the arguments and are able to show that there is a direct benefit towards those smaller nations by abandoning the idealization of democracy, and second, that there's also a direct benefit in terms of protecting US interests, what you're able to demonstrate then is that rather these are benefits that accrue as an outcome of the US pivoting away, and then whatever harms opposition pushes in this round, all of those things need to be compared and weighed against the benefits that you're able to bring in this particular debate. Right, so I think this is more or less it for the Gulf case. In most IR debates, there are like just 10,000 things you can argue on either side. I'm sure there's a host of other different arguments you can explore on the Gulf bench as well. But I think for this motion, this is where I envision most of the debate to happen. Okay, so anyone have questions before we move on to the op case?
Yeah, teacher.
Yeah.
Basically, right now under the status quo, where the US intervenes to impose democracy or certain autocratic nations, does it look like building strong democratic institutions like, an independent judiciary, a strong legislative government, emphasizing the importance of democracy through education? Or does it look like, the US is saying, hey, here's an election and just dip from that, And I think if it's the second scenario, I think that's what led to most people voting for radical parties to begin with, because they're not exposed to that. Yeah,
correct. So ever since the first failed intervention in Rwanda, there's been a lot of academic studies on how do you help a post-conflict nation move forward. And every single one of those studies have identified the necessity of the creation and the enforcement of those democratic institutions. So things like judiciary, things like the law, like a parliament and state and all that stuff. The thing, or like the problem is that the gap between idealism and reality is often called politics. And there isn't sufficient political incentives for the US to invest in post-war reconstruction to the extent that is required for those nations to heal properly. So of all the case studies that we've looked at so far, the US knows what it needs to do in order to construct those nations properly, but because the politicians in those places are bound by political incentives, if the people within their constituencies don't care enough about the people abroad, they're just less likely to support those kinds of initiatives, but also means that the capacity for those leaders to do those things is just reduced, because obviously if they pump money overseas, then they will lose the next election. But also they have a direct interest in maintaining their political legitimacy and their political power back home, which is why there is no incentive for them to do that. So that's why the idealization of democracy should include the construction of these institutions, but in reality often does not happen. That's why it's like that. Obviously, you can make the claim in opposition that the US moving into the future is likely to learn from its mistakes and improve its efforts to invest in nations in the future. You can also talk about the influence of China, why this directly changes the incentives of Joe Biden right now to invest in different types of infrastructure development to increase US influence and capturing of nations like Southeast Asia, like the Philippines, for example. But regardless, if it comes down to a clash or a clash of which characterization is more true, the one that wins out, or the team that wins out, is the team that's able to explain the structural incentives behind your claim and why your claim is more likely to be true. So explaining the political incentives here is what helps Gulf win out on the characterization that post-war reconstruction is likely to be quite bad. I hope that's
thank you.
All right. Anyone else? Okay, if no other questions. What the heck, it's 8 o'clock already. Okay, we'll just move on to the op case very quickly. So I think that all of the contextual analysis here, like who the US is, what democracy, foreign policy, all this stuff, these things you need to do on both sides of the house. Okay, so I think that means that the word government should not be here. It should in fact be here. Yes, correct. So government, yeah, so obviously you need to do all these context and identify all those things. Then after that, same thing, you need to identify the thesis statement, a problem statement in this debate. Should the US do this? And the burden of opposition to show that the harms outweigh the benefits. Nice. Okay, so what is the harms of the US abandoning its idealization of democracy? And how does it manifest in this real world, in this world? Anonymous Turtle said give way to communists. I mean, if the communist is Bernie Sanders, I don't think that's a bad thing, per se. Okay, so the first thing I think you want to look at on opposition is to examine the reasons why the US is trying to propagate democracy in this world to begin with. I think then you can talk about, okay, there are 2 or 3 things you want to talk about here. The first is in terms of why the US intervened, or why there was a necessity to intervene. And the second is sort of what the US intended to do. Like obviously what they intended to do is different from what actually manifested in reality. But looking at the intention to intervene and sort of set up democracy, in terms of explaining why democracy is like the preferable form of government out there. Okay, so why did the US intervene? Why does the US intervene to prop democracy? First and most obvious reason is to prevent human rights abuses, right? This is direct genocide by oppressive regimes. Okay. So here you can look at the invasion of Afghanistan, because I think it's fair to say that the government of Iraq and the government of Iraq that time Saddam Hussein was quite bad in terms of how he treated his people. So you have direct problems of the killings or like extrajudicial state-sanctioned killings, and like from Hadera. The other thing you can look at is like the Rwandan genocide. And stuff. These are examples of massive human rights violations, and the fact that the US being the moral policeman of the world, or seeing themselves as the moral policeman of the world, just means that they are the only nation that has capacity and incentive to intervene and protect the most vulnerable people within those nations. Right? The idealization of democracy, the only reason slash incentive for the US to intervene militarily in problematic states. So I think there's a very clear direct benefit here in terms of the protection of human life and the protection of the vulnerable that will otherwise become victims of state-sanctioned violence in those places. So protection of people, immediate sense, otherwise killed by the state. Right? So that's why the idealization of democracy is really important, because it gives the incentives for the US to intervene within those places and sort of dismantle oppressive states and attempt to reinstate better ones. Right? So this is the most direct benefit and the most low-hanging fruit that you want to talk about in opposition, because obviously Gulf will have to defend the US not intervening. And if the US does not intervene, places like Belarus, where opposition leaders are jailed, places like China or Saudi Arabia, where dissidents are jailed and shackled, means that just means that people die, basically. The second thing you want to explain on the opposition then is sort of the intention as to why the US wants to intervene, right? So here's where you want to explain why democracy is the preferable system of governments. So obviously the ways that governments manifest themselves and how they govern the people is quite speculative most of the time. Like you have very good autocracies, you also have very bad autocracies, you have good democracies, and you also have very bad democracies. So if you want to compare the structure of government, you obviously can't compare it in a vacuum. You need to compare it and assess it within the context in which it is argued, or in which it is to be implemented rather, in order to argue for its efficacy. But in circumstances or like outside of context in general, I think that you can argue and push that democracy is actually the preferable system of government just because it is the more representative form of government, right? So yeah, there's a few reasons why democracy is just morally good. It devolves power to the people through systems of election and stuff. It enforces accountability for those that hold power, and it ensures representation. People funds are used for their benefit, and they determine where they want their nation to go. So this is basically why democracy is the preferable system of governments. And I think that there's a lot, there's like in terms of outcomes, there are ways that you can argue why democracy is often implemented poorly, even if the end outcome can be something that is good. And here's where you probably need to mechanize a bit as to how the idealization of democracy can lead towards the implementation of democracies in ways that are good. Yeah. Lead to implementation of democracy. And because democracy is just the morally superior form of government, you can then say that it is morally good to just try to implement it, even if it does not result in a proper functional democracy. I think that's the first way to argue, to make the case. The second way is to say that nascent democracies and poor implementation of democracies now is necessary in supporting the slow and gradual transition towards a functional democracy. So this probably looks like Malaysia. You have this one very strong political party that's just basically holding power for the past 50 years. And then in one election, this Barisan Nasional effectively was voted out by an opposition party. Like granted, opposition was, used to be part of BN and stuff. And Malaysian politics in general is it's a mess lah. Let's be real. But like that is an example of how the existence of democratic structures is a good thing because it could eventually be used to support a democratic transition of power. And a democratic transition of power is always preferable to a violent revolution and a violent transition of power. Because if people die, infrastructure gets damaged, development suffers. Right? So yeah, first thing, temp itself is moral, dependent of outcomes. Second is creation of structures, eventually smooth transition to democracy. And the third thing, and here's where I think you sort of want to directly argue against the political incentives to invest in the third world. You can provide reasons why the US has incentives to invest in proper nation reconstruction. I think there's two reasons that you can identify. First is just historical precedents, or learn from mistakes. Okay, Mistakes are costly. Better implementation of democracy saves money, direct political benefits, look good internationally, etc. Everyone wants to be the politician that brought democracy to the third world. The second reason actually is because of China. So the US and China are currently fighting for global hegemony. But one thing about China and the way that they spread their influence is through the BRI is that China has an incentive to prop up and support dictators and autocracies. So like in Sudan, for instance, or in like, okay, maybe not Sri Lanka, but like Myanmar is a very good example where China props up autocracies and stuff. So it is in the US's interest as far as possible to convert as many nations to democracies as possible in order to reduce China's ability to prop up dictatorships and gain influence by propping up those autocratic things. So US wants to challenge China's hegemony and of dictatorships, right? By converting nations to democracies. But also, this is the incentive required to weigh against the political incentives by explaining how incentives to ensure post-war reconstruction is done well. So all the information as to how to transition a nation exists in academia. The US just needs to implement those things. So they need to get like someone who has studied it to set up those systems, set up a commission to get those things done, and then adequately fund it and sustain the effort until it is done properly. Yep, ironically, the only incentive to do good is a selfish incentive to screw over your enemies. Very nice. Okay, the last thing you can sort of talk about here is actually is to talk about not just the US support, but to talk about support for international organizations, things like the IMF, things like the World Bank and stuff. The fact that these nations that are funded by the US or the alternative exists to help the transition into a democracy means that there will always be the political will and there will always be the incentive push to create those fundings and to enforce those things, basically. Yeah. Okay, there's actually one more thing that I just want to talk about on opposition. I forgot about this. Is that the idealization of democracy also involves the sanctioning of political leaders that engage in bad things like undemocratic stuff. You want to say you can prop sanctions being necessary, or rather the lack of sanctions meaning that those autocratic nations can start building economic prosperity and stuff, which legitimizes those states and those governments to stay in power longer, and therefore continue the oppression and human rights abuses that exist out there across the board. So everything else is just explaining the argument and then structuring it in a way that makes sense. So that's more or less it for the op case. I think there's a whole bunch of other things you can argue in opposition as well. But I think that by and large, this is the most important argument and discussion that should come out. So anyone got questions so far? All right, if not, this document, like the case file is like I posted it up already, you can refer to it in the future. And I hope this was helpful. If got question anytime, feel free to drop me a text or like just post it in the motion discussion thing. We will usually got people interested enough to respond to stuff. Okay, so that should be it for the workshop today. Hope it was helpful.
Thanks, TJ.
For coming.
Thanks, TJ.
Thanks.
No problem.